Welcome to Liquid Assets. I'm your host, Ravi Karani. Liquid Assets is a podcast that looks at the world of water through the lens of business, technology, and policy. Today, we have an awesome guest for you. We have Alec Ajnsztajn from CoFlux Purification.
Hi, I'm Alec Ajnsztajn, co-founder and CEO of CoFlux Purification. We are a company that both captures and destroys PFAS in water. And today we're going to be talking about, Ravi, about that, PFAS regulations, and how we kind of see the market moving forward.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. Here, we're in person in New York, which is fun to see. This is the first for you, Ravi. So
this is super exciting for me too, because it's like my first in-person podcast. So, just saying, if there's anything weird that happens today, it's because it's our first, both of our firsts.
Yeah.
Let's jump into it. So you're here talking about PFAS. We've had PFAS on the podcast a few times. Let's just go back to the basics. I think the audience, we see this forever chemical. We see PFAS. Walk us through what is PFAS? What's happening today in the world of PFAS?
So quickly defining PFAS. PFAS are a class of chemicals that have carbon-fluoride bonds, which sound very chemistry in a general audience, but what it basically means is they're really sticky, kind of strong bond, and so they don't break down. And that's mean they have great properties. I'm a polymer chemist by training, and so when you think about making chemistry, especially things like Teflon, which was one of the initial big uses, they don't stick to oils, they don't stick to water, they don't stick to greases. You can still get air through them. Think of early applications like Gore-Tex, which were breathable water and oil-proof membranes for waterproofing shoes. And so that meant a huge kind of use case across them. But the same properties that make them have all these great properties also means that they don't break down and they can bioaccumulate. And as we've gotten more and more knowledge, right, we've realized that they start to accumulate in the body. It doesn't have natural processes to break them down. And we've seen serious health effects caused because they can accumulate in human bodies. And current kind of research is that depending on how you define it, 97 to 99% of all humans have testable levels of PFAS in blood. And we've seen PFAS tested for in every rainwater shed in the world, including the Arctic and Antarctic. And so we have a huge prevalence problem, both in, health in humans, but also ecological health.
That's crazy. So I just want to replay some of that back to you. About 97 to 99% of humans have some sort of PFAS inside of them. And this carbon-fluoride bond, let's just go back to kind of when PFAS was made, right? Because if it keeps on accumulating, that means we're making more of it. And so, when was it started?
Yeah.
How did we make it? You said Gore-Tex, Teflon?
Yeah, so it actually started with the Manhattan Project.
Okay.
So the origin of PFAS was that uranium hexafluoride, and there's a great Veritasium video on the history of this, is a really caustic thing, and they need to basically figure out how to enrich this. And DuPont at the time was working on these carbon fluoride polymers that they had discovered in the lab, Plunkett, basically because a bunch of fluoride gas had polymerized, and they're like, what's going on? But there really wasn't a use case for it until the Manhattan Project, where they needed to figure out a material that could withstand the uranium hexafluoride in the refining process to make the Manhattan atomic bonds.
Yeah.
And that meant there was a capacity, especially this actually was really in South Jersey. And then what happened after that is that they needed these processing aids in the polymerization. So basically, the problem when you make these chemicals is you're putting a gas, it'll rise. You need to basically suppress it so it doesn't create a bunch of heat and blow up. And so you add in these surfactants, basically fancy soaps, into the manufacturing process. And then that lets you actually do the reactions in water. And that was what 3M added with DuPont. And those were the first kind of one where they started. And that was in the 40s. And then in the 50s, when you had the kind of plastics revolution, not just these fluoropolymers or those things, but you're talking things from polyethylene, plastic bags, right? One of the great kind of material science leap forwards that we've had in the world, right? They started looking for other applications for it. And we didn't have a really robust understanding of both toxicology and regulatory frameworks of how to bring new materials into it. So we spent a ton of time making all these plastics, and not just PFAS, without fully understanding what the long-term health effects were going to be. And this was because you don't see really kind of environmental movement and this kind of, idea about how we are approaching regulations, chemicals, infrastructure as a whole. I think it's not just chemicals. You would think about infrastructure right until the 60s. Silent Spring being, Russell Carson's book being kind of the big turning point there in a lot of kind of popular culture.
Yeah. Crazy. So this chemical came about from the Manhattan Project when we were developing the nuclear bomb. And then 3M and DuPont obviously found this amazing use in this world of plastics, right? And then in the 60s, we started making plastic bags. We started having Tupperware was glass, but you have these storage containers. You're
putting coatings on pizza boxes. You're using it as lubricant for bike chains.
Yeah, and this sounds like a magic chemical, right?
Yeah.
So we basically like put it in everything. And when did we kind of come to the realization, given the timeline, that like, hey, this stuff is probably not the best?
Yeah. So, a lot of that came in the 90s. I think that there's, the lawyer whose name escapes me in West Virginia with the DuPont one with the runoff on a lot of the one. And then also we saw a lot of agricultural stuff, and that led to testing lawsuits, and then actually caused a whole change in how we approach both the lawsuit regulations, but also in how we choose to water things. So now the EPA runs something called the UNC, the Unregulated Water Contaminant Testing Research Survey. So the UNC they're on 6 now. They started in 2000s partly in response to PFAS and other things to test what is even in water. And then in 2016, that was the end of the Obama administration. They actually changed how the EPA how we approach new chemicals under a thing called TSCA, the Toxic Substances Chemical Act. And so that was, which did exist, but they made an amendment to basically do more proactive risk assessments. Not to get too into regulation. But those kind of a lot of that came from a lot of the PFAS and all these things where now we realized, wow, it is everywhere, and we didn't have good data on where it is, the prevalence, how are we approaching risk assessments for new chemicals, and what are the tools to do that.
And what was the inflection point at, like, when you're developing anything to be able to measure if there is something in the water, you need to like understand the reagent and the analyte, right? And so like, how did we say like, hey, this PFAS, all this plastic stuff we've been making is actually showing itself in water? Like what? Yeah,
that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with like the analytical chemistry history more from the material side. But I know that the original lot of it started in kind of the mid 90s with a lot of the, as DuPont there, some of the lawsuits, and that caused a lot of what was, previously internal documents to be public, and that encouraged a lot of the testing on it. But the ability to do the analytical chemistry of the mass specs, especially to the levels we're seeing now in the regulation, is really something that's been happening in the last 10 years. So there's been a lot of work on how do we actually test and find, especially when we're talking about parts per trillion. Which is what the drinking water standards are, which I know there's been a little movement since maybe you last had a podcast specifically about PFAS and the regulations on where we are there and how that came to be.
Yeah, I definitely do want to talk about the kind of regulatory side and the kind of how we've matured from my previous episodes. One thing before we leave this topic, you had said 97 to 99% of people have PFAS inside of them. With the kind of wellness trends with being able to like the whole quantified self, what do you like? Is this something to be worried about? Should I be like drinking more like water? Does like water flush it out? Like how do I fix this?
Right now, really the only way that we've seen big drops, and I think this is from a woman who's pregnant because it can pass on the child's. There's been some initial research now on using kind of ion exchange resins on it, or you can go donate plasma.
Okay.
If you donate plasma, blood be bigger there because it's an accumulation thing. So as you remove liquid, you'll make new liquid that doesn't have the PFAS in it. But they're still not there. Now, if you're not in a super, super high toxic area, right, there's a lot of, it's hard to tease out how bad it is for you.
Is there a test? Could I go to like One Medical and get a PFAS test?
You can get a PFAS test. You can.
Okay.
Though, for my own, this is more of a personal opinion on it, is that like the over quantification of things and trying to like make metrics is not how biological systems work.
Sure.
And so, I would not freak out about it if it's not something there. Now, if you want to test your well, right, if you're on a well or you want to do things, or if you're on public water, you can definitely look up they have to publish the data now. They're starting the ones on public water quality reports on it. Do that. It's funny, bottled water, especially if it's mineral water, doesn't actually have the same testing requirements. So You can look that up, and that's where it's about exposure. And if you want to test your exposure, that's where I would start. And then you can buy home filtration systems. Not what we sell, but if you're really worried about it from a wellness perspective. But sometimes over quantification of things can lead to the relative risk versus absolute risk can be hard to tease out.
For sure. Yeah. And you had mentioned if you're in a high prevalence area, is there, just kind of thinking of like Pareto, right? This kind of 80-20. Should I focus my energy if I live in one of these areas, and is there a map that I can like look at?
Yeah, so the Environmental Working Group has a map online for PFAS testing, which will show kind of sites that have been tested online. It's a great kind of resource in the U.S. where they've accumulated a bunch of regulator and state data, as well as these the EPA's testing that they do on that. It was the last one was the UNWR5. And so they have a map with all of that. Also, if you're near any sort of military bases, any sort of maybe chemical manufacturing there, or, there's a lot of places on it, but that's where I would start. And then, if you happen to be on a well, right, you're probably going to want to do your own water quality testing regardless.
Sure.
Versus the city. New York actually doesn't have that big an issue. Just because, New York's water supply comes from the Catskills, so it's upstream. It's actually quite good. I forget. I'm in Texas, but I forget that when I drink the tap water here, I'm like, wow, this tastes so much better. I'm very sensitive to tap water. I think about it a lot. The point where, like, Houston's a lot on surface water.
Yeah.
And as you get seasonal differences and they pull more surface water into the groundwater, right, you get basically a buildup of a chemical called geomycin, which makes it a little earthy. And I will be like, oh, we changed the water supply. And then sometimes like a couple days it'll be like, yeah, the water changed and we can't add more chlorine for deodorant. So like the water's going to be a little mucky, put it through a filter. And that happens in Houston. And I will notice it first and ask my friends. They're like, I don't get it. And then 3 days later, they're all complaining. So...
What's the filter you have at your house? What do you use?
So yeah, I actually mainly use any sort of activated carbon, home filters. Okay. And then if you want anything there, I actually really like Life Straw.
Life Straw, okay. Yeah.
So they have some good things. They also do a lot of things for microbial relations, and they do a lot of work in areas with low water access. But they also have an activated carbon ion exchange, and they have an antimicrobial filter in it as well. So
you don't have like an RO filter? Or like
no,
RO machine
I do not have an RO machine. Home RO machines are not great. They're actually quite annoying. And the problem with RO is that RO works a little too well, so it strips all your minerals. And so if you don't remineralize it, so if you don't do your maintenance well, it can cause issues.
Yeah.
And so I do not have a home RO machine because I will just look at the water quality reports, and for the most part, as long as you're changing your activated carbon filters, it's fine. Activated carbon for a home use works quite well.
Do you have like a brand or something that somebody should like outside of Life Straw? Should I have like a Brita or?
I would need to look at it. I make sure you understand whether it's activated carbon.
For sure.
But yeah, Life Straw just use activated carbon. I have not done enough digging on the specific. There's a lot on the consumer product. There's a lot of consumer products.
I do get this question running a water podcast a ton.
Yes. So I've always recommended Life Straw. That's my go-to if people ask.
Cool. Let's pivot over to CoFlux. We just talked about PFAS. PFAS is a huge issue. It's this forever chemical. It's inside of all of our bodies. It kind of is and is not a problem. And so why do you care about this? What's the founding story of CoFlux? What are you doing to solve this problem?
So I think to start a little bit, CoFlux came out of my PhD and postdoctoral work at Rice University in Houston, Texas. A lot of water stuff there, where we were looking at water contaminants. But my background actually is I'm a material scientist, polymer chemist. I think I mentioned that at the top of the podcast. And it came out of our work on developing new sorbent materials and also new photocatalytic materials. Originally, actually, we were looking at these materials to make polymers and chemicals with. So we're using them to do synthesis. How do we use basically polymers to make polymers? So plastics to make plastics.
Yeah.
And then we realized, well, if we can do that kind of chemistry, can we apply it to water treatment contaminants? Because we have these sorbent structures that are basically super porous. They're basically a sponge that can absorb a lot of stuff, and then we can then basically use light to then actually not only just remove them, but also to break them down, unzip the molecules, produce basically harmless minerals, carbon dioxide, fluoride that can stay in the water. And so that was the origin from the technology side. My own more personal idea in it is that I've always kind of been obsessed with infrastructure. So from a kid on it, when that goes from things, highways, trains, waterways. It led me some detours where in grad school, after grad school, I actually ran a citywide ballot initiative in Houston about how we allocate infrastructure funding. Oh. So it's a different thing. But PFAS are a challenge where I've always thought, there's a lot of infrastructure problems, but there actually aren't that many science technology problems in infrastructure, right? And this is, I think, a problem that we are particularly bad at because they're path dependency, regulatory, or financing problems. PFAS is kind of this weird problem where it has all of that, but it's also a science problem.
Yeah.
They're also how do we, find a, effective, way to actually treat the waste that isn't going to basically become economically unsustainable.
Interesting. I want to go back to that ballot initiative really quick. What was the impetus of that?
Yeah, the impetus of that. So, okay, I'm going to do this quickly. So Houston had a big highway expansion that is still happening that I was not particularly in favor of. To expand a bunch of highway downtown, it was going to take actually over 5,000 different properties, over 300 businesses, 500 people's homes. And so there was a lot of pushback on that from planning because it was, looking at urban core stuff or other things, how we're doing things, and also flood things. And here's a fun fact from TxDOT's actually own, this is in TxDOT. I know this is a water podcast, not a climate podcast, but TxDOT in 2013 basically in their own study said that 0.48% of all CO2 emissions in the world come from transportation in Texas. Now, some of this is tied to the oil and gas industry, transport, but it's crazy, and
Sure.
I can even send you the reference for this. And so that's kind of how I got into it, right? Because, infrastructure, why did I decide to go to grad school to study, materials and energy, water, climate, and, energy and water are tied together, right? And so that kind of led to that, and that's where that led to something where every city has something that allocates federal funding, especially transportation dollars, and things for air quality as well, which are big things called Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO. They're really under talked about, and they decide these planning things. And so for plans to allocate there, so the way that Houston's is set up is that it really favored the outlying, exurban and suburban counties over the internal city core, which is what led to a plan where the city had an alternative vision and the more destructive vision actually got passed. And so this is really framed at how do we restructure that and how do we make sure that when we're thinking about that, because this also affects when we're talking about health and water quality, well, we're also talking air quality, particulate matter, right? Tires, and I think that we're eventually get into it, but tires also have water quality things, right? We're seeing new contaminants, things like 6-PDQ are coming that we're starting to monitor, and so they're really all things. And if you look at it, right, like if you have a elementary school on a highway, right, you get much higher rates of asthma, just because of the particulate matter, and so this is kind of all related. So that's how I got into that, and that's what kind of and reflects some of the research. But this is where why the company is, it felt like this is where we needed to take the technology and actually bring it into the market, where there was going to be a need to have that infrastructure of both technology and, actual infrastructure and big infrastructure, big changes, 30, 40-year timeline horizons.
Impressive. And when you look at the PFAS and infrastructure problem, it seems like we could there's like multiple solutions, right? You could just stop making this magic chemical.
Well,
or it's like, oh, we've already done the damage. And
we could stop making the magic chemical, and then we could have no more computer chips.
Sure.
So I don't think that we're going to be doing that. So on the computer chip, I actually in grad school spent 6 months at Intel, so can talk a little bit about computer chips, but computer chips. Need PFAS. The way that we do what's called photolithography, which is basically how you do the patterning. It's you're taking a little, high energy laser and you're basically making little things, right? And it uses something that, I'm going to be slightly technical, called chemically amplified photoresist. And basically what that is that the light is actually triggering a chain reaction of chemistry that starts this polymer reaction in the photoresist. And the chemicals used there are traditionally PFAS based. Now, the semiconductor has been proactive. They phased out the longer chains PFOS and PFOA in the mid-2000s. Now they're on PFAS and they're looking for other alternatives. But there's still other things and things that can break down that are all across it. So I don't think we're going to stop using them tomorrow.
Okay, so we can't stop using them.
No.
They show up in chips. They show up in Gore-Tex, in our North Face jackets, in our Teflon and then they end up in the landfill, which then show up in our water. And so,
Yes.
like, how does this get, like, there's obviously like a consumer play here, right? I could have a filter in my home.
Yep.
You guys are targeting the, like, wastewater and utility side of things from an infrastructure standpoint. How does that work? Like, you kind of briefly mentioned that your thesis was around making an absorbent and then photocatalytic material, so you can basically unzip the CNF. Walk us through that. Like, kind of, how does that work?
So a lot of the issue of thinking drinking water or even site remediation is that your contamination levels are really low. So I know that we kind of gloss over the regulation, but I think now we kind of have to at least bring it up for this to make sense.
Sure.
So the MCLs for drinking water, which are, there's been some back and forth with the current administration, but as of last month, they're fully finalized.
And MCL is?
Minimum maximum contamination level. So basically the one are now at 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. Now, there were 4 other ones that they've rolled back, and I think there's been a lot of press being like, oh, they're rolling back things. Here's the thing from all the data. Of the, I think, 6,600 municipalities, for about 30% of all, 40% of all water in the U.S. who would need treatment, only 11 are out of compliance, or now not, are in compliance with the 4 versus the other ones. So when we're thinking about what the rollback did, and then there's a path to push things forward, but if they're over 4 times those levels, they have to put temporary things in 2029, not 2031. So part of it is that it's given the municipalities a little more breathing room. And, municipalities these are ratepayer based systems, right? Like, if they can't get external funding, it's purely on tax base. And when you're talking about smaller municipal systems or big municipal systems, right? These can be an issue and barrier where either you don't have the tax base or you have people who are now going to have, you're looking at 30-40% of increases in your water bills, where even if they have bonding capacity, so then they have to work with, a lot of those. And so there is money available. But that's going to be a huge issue, which is why, there isn't, so it would, I do think testing for more things is good, but from an actual what the impact is going to be compared to some of the headlines that I think we've seen, it's actually not going to really change we're going to get a lot of removal. The systems are going to come in place. We're going to start having drinking water systems, but then also beyond the drinking water stuff, it's the whole kind of utility ones where now there's MCLs, and if you're doing something where you're pulling drinking water from surface water, the surface water is contaminated, and that might be coming out from some wastewater site further upstream, or might have industrial users coming in. That's where you might want to put pretreatment in, so this way you can get more things on it. So then it's not just the utilities treating it at that drinking water side. It's how are they looking at their wastewater? How are they looking at the whole water supply? When they're looking at industrial customers, industrial users, they're putting permits on them through industrial pretreatment programs, which is something that's actually a federally mandated program where, depending on the EPA can basically tell your utility, hey, you need to go, we're getting these high levels. You have the authority to go put permits on your industrial users.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because my next question was actually going to be around, and you had brought up kind of the climate angle of this, is like the externalities of this, right? Like you had mentioned that you can't just cut off making PFAS because we need them for the chips, right? But the chip manufacturers are basically downstream affecting my utility bill by 30 to 40% because, like, I'm having to comply as a city. Like,
and the chip manufacturers are particularly good. A lot of them do really low or zero liquid discharge. So they've gotten it because they've always had these issues.
Sure.
So they're but industry across a whole. No, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So I think that to really think through that is where we are, and that's where I'm one person, one company, one technology, and that's an ecosystem problem.
Yeah.
And really being able for us to understand what we can and can't do, and how are we going to actually allocate capital to do that. So we're using the regulations and we're using these things to price in innovation as well, right? I've said this a lot, and then people accuse me of sounding like an economist, right? But the whole thing about regulating a market is pricing in externalities.
Of course.
And so how we're going to start doing that, moving from just testing and conversation to, okay, now we're going to start actually spending capital. Well, what are we spending it on? And are we creating path dependence on some technologies over other? And then what happens when we get the bill 30 years down the line?
Yeah, totally. So how does CoFlux work?
Yes, so that's a great question. So we have our covalent organic framework material, right, which in a sense is very fancy, but it's basically a very fancy polymer. It's super high surface area. So it's basically a sponge, and in the kind of surface of your hand, you have as much surface area as a football field, and a couple grams in your hand. And that lets us really absorb onto a lot of PFAS. And because it's fully organic, it's selective to organic molecules over, say, salts and ions, which can be quite useful. And so in some ways, it's that's similar to activated carbon. However, because we've designed it with these photoactive centers, and that's inherent to the material. So the material was built, bottom up, designed in this way that we could do that. So when you shine UVC light, basically think your standard UV disinfection lights. They're cheap, they're easy, they're everywhere. They're used from both disinfection to more advanced, oxidation processes for, more higher water level reuse in both things from industrial cleaning water or treating water to where you're using, like, say, reuse in wastewater. And so these are existing, well understood, light sources. And so we're like, okay, if we can use that, we can design reactors that can take advantage of this capture part to do both a concentration and a destruction, so then we can target these lower concentration sites where you see a lot of sites, because the best way to do this, if you have a high capacity site, so where you've used a lot of AFFF, right, or you have an impacted aquifer, you can go clean up the aquifer before it even gets pumped into your utility.
Sure.
Right? And so, which can be pros and cons, because the negative on the drinking water side, right, is drinking water super regulated. So putting a new material, putting a new process into drinking water takes a lot of regulatory barriers and a lot of data. So you got to go find that data. So we can't just go plug it in tomorrow. We don't want to. The etymology of utilities exists for a reason, right? To be able to utilize anything, the utilities has kind of happened in the 1800s, early 1800s, where people started calling water and electricity utilities for that exact reason. And so and that's totally fair to operators, right? But that means that it's hard for them to adopt new technology if they can't figure out how they're going to pilot it.
100%, yeah, and to your point, right? You don't want to be changing water systems as quickly as you're changing your
no. This is not a move fast and break things kind of thing. Absolutely not.
And so, do you then focus on the waste side of things, right? So you look at like wastewater,
contaminated aquifers, right? Contaminated sites. This is where all the DoD bases, right? And this is all publicly available, right? Where the firefighting foams, right, have really high. You're talking 4 or 5 times higher than what the MCLs are. Contamination levels. That's in like a relatively constrained environment. And if you can go and actually clean it up before it gets into your general supply, that's going to be better demand on it. But then you have kind of the issues in the technology where we can destroy PFAS. And I'm going to pick on the Department of War right now, because they just released new guidance in March about how to deal with impacted PFAS and impacted materials. So, which is actually quite good, because I think that back to new regulations is how do you encourage people to try new stuff that can create step changes in efficacy, in cost effectiveness, in adoption. And so the guidance, right, is that we've seen that incineration can work if you have the right conditions. I think there are 4 facilities in the U.S. that meet those criteria in the DOD guidance. I'd have to double check that, but last time I looked it up. And then, obviously, your standard absorption stuff or deep well injection. The problem with absorption is you still have the material, so you still have to send it to incinerator. Right? And then deep well injection is fine, but we're just kicking the can down the road if you can inject it. So, I live in Texas. We can inject lots of things in Texas.
Sure.
But not every state can do that. Not every state has the capacity. And we're running out of injection of these deep well, Class B injection well capacity. Because a lot of them are actually being used for basically where we've done enhanced oil and gas recovery, so fracking for residual produced water. That is a big problem in the Permian, but even you see that in Pennsylvania, right, where Pennsylvania doesn't allow deep well injection, so they have to ship the waste somewhere else. New Mexico doesn't allow deep well injection, so they ship it to Texas.
Yeah.
So, and that's not PFAS, but that it's not a super long-term thing. And you can use hazmat landfills. You can use other landfills. But to your earlier point, you still create leachate, and you still have to treat.
Exactly, yeah.
Because part of the regulation, you have to go treat the leachate. At some point, you can't let it out.
Just leave it out, and then it just becomes a problem again, basically. And so when you're looking at your sponge with the
Oh, there's one point on the guidance which the pick on is that that was the whole point I was making, is that they did add a new line in it that is going to make it easier to try new technologies where you can work with regulators. So that gives them a carve out
from the Department of War.
For the Department of War,
okay.
yes, to try out new things. So
that's
that's a good step, is what I wanted to point out.
Yeah.
That in the new guidance, they specifically have things to call it new technologies for destruction, where if you can get the regular approvals and work with a specific office, they will allow new technologies, not just from a piloting, but from an actual procurement perspective.
Procurement and deployment perspective.
Yep.
Amazing. And where are they primarily deploying? These would be on bases, or it could be...
That's for the market to go. I mean, we can go into kind of the state of the art in the treatment technologies, but this is where a lot of these hydrothermal technologies, things like supercritical water oxidation, are going to be centralized.
Yeah.
Because you have air stacks, and they're just not mobile.
For sure. So how does CoFlux, is this like the size of
ours
an
is
air
a mobile unit,
conditioner? Or like,
so
what does
think,
it look like?
Yeah, so smaller air conditioner. Our current skid is like a 4x8 trailer that we're bringing out to the field. So that's it's right now it's sitting in Texas, but we're actually shipping it out in 2 months. Right now is the goal. It's still coming together.
Yeah.
For the first kind of long term, multiple month long trial, and so that. But that's a small one. We're doing about 5 gallons an hour. So the bigger units are going to be, something that you can put in, on a trailer, right? And then you can get up to where you're doing, 5 to 20 gallons a minute,
okay,
right? But our system, because it's based on the material UV light, it's room temperature, it's room pressure. So to scale it up, we just, we have these modular tanks, right? We're speccing out some tank sizes, and then we just have to add enough of them to get to the treatment levels. Yeah. And part of the design choice is that multiple tanks makes it really easy to do that. So then you can spec out, okay, we need to get to this treatment level, right? We know what the power, the retention time, how much material we have to dose in based on the water quality we're treating. And then we can, basically the skid kind of stays the same, but we can change out the tanks to fit those needs.
Okay. Really, really interesting. So as you're kind of putting these things in series and parallel, if you look at like the average municipality or the average wastewater plant, how big?
So from
how much energy?
The energies are big. I mean, we're really targeting that. We can get basically to under what would be effectively 100 kilowatt hours per meter cubed. Hold on, what is that in gallons? It's about 2 kilowatt hours under 2 kilowatt hours per gallon. If we're talking about getting to like MCLs, so. It's still the energy's there, and we want to get that down lower and lower.
Sure.
But we have way less capital needs
because
it's pumps, tanks, and our material. So we have this couple material, but that's centralized, right? And we don't need a lot of it because it's super porous. So, our current, 5 gallon per hour kind of one that's more for these kind of impact well systems, right, takes about 20 grams of material.
Okay.
So you can, we do that in our lab.
Sure.
And then the next scale is we're scaling up to really make a more production kilogram, per day production line. And that, is still going to be, there. So we actually don't need a ton of our material. And because of the UV light, it's effectively self-cleaning. So you have longer lifetime. I'm not saying it's not going to ever have to be changed out, but, it's not accumulating in PFAS in the same way absorbents are. And you're increasing the lifetime, also reducing both the liability risk. You're getting rid of your, targeted compounds, you're putting them in the minerals, and then you're absorbing out into it too. So you're getting both there. So how we like to think of it is it kind of sits in that, sorbent category, but more of a self-regenerable sorbent, but with a destruction component on top of it.
Yeah.
And that really helps us target these kind of mobile sites where, when you're thinking about waste, to get your point, municipal ones are doing millions of gallons a day. You have to go do 50 gallons per minute, 300 gallons per minute, 1,000 gallons per minute, are huge. And those are where things make sense to start speccing out very specific. It's where you need some design specific to the site. You have space constraints, all these things. But there's a lot of space where there's mobile wastewater on it, where you have, wells, where maybe you're doing pump and treat, where the flow rates are smaller, right? Those projects can last a while. Or even smaller projects where you use things like AFFF. So you have the AFFF concentrate. That's hard to deal with. That's its own thing. They're starting to kind of think about incinerating it. But then every time you go clean out AFFF, right, from...
Can you define AFFF?
Oh, yes, aqueous filled foam. So it's what's used everywhere. So actually, let me give an example. So let me do an example here. So it's what's used in fire extinguishers mainly for petroleum fires. So in 2019, actually, in Houston, we had something called the ITC fire, which is a 5-mile plume in a tank farm. And if you really want a fun video, the U.S. Chemical Safety Board does these great reenactments of fires. Since they have one on YouTube, you can go look it up. I can send it to you after this, Robbie.
Yeah.
And they used 130,000 gallons of AFFF to put out that fire in Houston. Because it's a oil and gas tank farm, and
Sure.
and when they're running the risk, it's do we PFAS or do we kill people? And I think 2 people actually died in that fire. I'd have to double check that, but I know there's a lot of fires in Houston. There's a lot of industrial disasters.
Yeah.
And so that's a risk they're weighing, right? Where long-term health versus acute risk. Now we have new foams that are coming that are on the market that are now finally actually have been military spec'd to do that. But every time you do those changeouts, you generate a lot of the waste because you have the foam mixing with water, mixing with things you're cleaning your systems with, whether that's from a fire truck to a big tank farm. And then also, and this is both for across any industry where you might think about using foam and using these chemicals. And then you also have the on-site, any sort of aquifer or well that you might have contaminated on those sites. And so those are smaller volumes. So that's where we're seeing things, because one thing I didn't mention at the top of the regulation is CERCLA, otherwise known as Superfund. So those are also in place where PFOS and PFOA are now on our hazardous substances. And that means that we're starting to see that, and that means it can get into your what's called an NDPS permit, which is your basically permit to operate and produce waste of some sort. And so that's something that's on the horizon when we're thinking about how that's going to impact. But great, you now go produce 40, 50,000 gallons of waste and it's sitting in a tank somewhere. Well, what do you do with it? That's expensive to go incinerate. You now have to run a bunch of treatment. Great. Well, now you have to run a bunch of treatment to maybe put it on a media that you still have to go ship and incinerate. And so our system is really set up to where we can go on site, do that treatment, right? Make it easier, make it more cost effective, and then be able to discharge there. Well, we can actually do the absorption on it, and then we can take the skid back for these shorter kind of more change-out projects, or ones we're just looking at maybe the wells are on it as well. And then we can also create systems that are bigger scale for one. So eventually the goal is, thinking about these huge scales, but if you're thinking about proving out the data to get, as I said, certifications to prove out to operators, right? Because operators want to work, especially municipalities, right? But these are ratepayer-based systems.
Yeah.
And there aren't market incentives for innovation. And, I think that, it goes the age-old line, like no one gets fired for IBM, though this is water, so maybe I should say no one gets fired for buying Hawk, is that they want to make sure they're in compliance and it's going to work because they don't want to, they're trying to not poison their customers.
Yeah,
they're trying to get it out of the water. And so you can't fault them for that.
So is your kind of demographic customer, like your perfect customer, the folks that are a little bit more mobile? Like if you have an event like this, you can just go and deploy your
Exactly.
skids.
An event, or you're changing something out, or they're doing changing out where it's more mobile, or they have a bunker, right? A lot of times you see this in airports where there's basically a collection bunker that sits for a couple of years and they have to pump it out occasionally to ship it, where you can, help basically there's an economic argument for it's going to be, cheaper, maybe cheaper is the wrong word. It's going to be more effective to this site because you're not having to deal with a one-off, high cost one. You can basically help spread out that cost and risk and really make sure you're doing it, and you don't have to deal with this big giant pile of waste when it becomes an issue.
Yeah. When does this, you'd mentioned that you have kind of the trailer in Texas from like a startup perspective. When does this get deployed?
That's what we're still doing our first a long-term deployment. So right now it's in August at a site in New Mexico. It's a government site. And so that's going to be the first one. And we're looking forward to it. I'm sure it's going to break.
Sure. As the first prototypes always do.
Right? And that's what we're there. And thankfully, the partner we're working with there, because it is kind of a more government, they're really set up to try to just test things.
Sure.
They're really set up as a partner who wants to try new things. So that's what we're really working on there with them, which is nice because it. We've tested their water samples. We've done the lab. There's tons of water samples sitting in my lab, right? It's always fun coming in the lab and telling my team, guys, we got 5 gallons of firefighting foam coming in. And they're like, okay. Yeah. Like they're both excited about it. Sure. But now you have
firefighting foam,
which is I think I said it earlier, is about 1 to 3% PFAS.
Yeah.
Plus all the other stuff.
Oh gosh.
So you're talking about how do you even deal with this waste? Partly there's contamination. Partly it's how do we make sure it doesn't contaminate the other samples.
Yeah.
In the lab. So it's actually making sure that we don't just start picking up. We're trying to test something that's in 100 parts per trillion. Can we get it down to 100 NCLs? And then we have something that's 1% PFAS. Making sure that nothing is touching each other.
It. Yeah.
Because PFAS loves to stick to things.
Yeah.
And that's the problem on the lighting system is that you'll clean it out and then you'll change it out and 10 years later it's still coming out.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. As you've like studied a ton about PFAS, what does like the regulation in the market get wrong about it? Like what should we be doing that we're not today?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question. I think, starting on the regular side of the drinking waters was about protecting human health because they were looking at, okay, it's in all their clothes, it's in all these products, and there's not a really easy way to get it out. Drinking water is the easiest. One, they want to reduce 80% of our consumption, so they want drinking water. But because we don't have clear industrial limits there, there's in state levels, that has made it hard for, market pricing on things on it because, the whole thing about water markets is that they're not markets. Yeah. They're ratepayer regulated utilities, and we actually haven't done any sort of market innovation. So, maybe this is a different podcast. Maybe you need to have someone talking about maybe, we can do some market things on it. But what always comes to mind is that if you look at in energy, right? There's two things. There's your Texas ERCOT approach of deregulate everything, which, is why we have so much solar and wind. Sometimes things fail, and I have a very fun story there where my water went out because it froze. The pipes were there. My PhD advisor, actually lives around the corner from me. So I called him and like, Jan, can I come use your bathroom in the middle of the freeze in 2021? So that was a stay there. Or you have California's approach where they have capacity markets, but also they put regulations for things like clean firm power. Yep. And we've seen that with geothermal. So, but that has encouraged, capital to come in on it. And we don't really have the same dynamics on the water side. And so I think that part of where things were maybe wrong is the wrong word, but what we haven't thought enough about is how do we make sure that when we're putting in regulations, we're doing it in a way that helps de-risk capital allocation into innovation, as well as, shows path to long-term revenue. So what the Department of War just did on the, able to add this into the guidance for the procurement is a big thing for, us as a startup when it comes to our narrative to, okay, great, this is now an ability to go from just running a pilot, even a paid pilot. That's nice, but it's not a long-term revenue generating contract. But having the ability to do that. So that's something that needs to be thought about more before in that, yes, we should be going after there. We know what the best, current method is, but we need to basically make sure there are ways that we're not stuck in path dependency to now, activated carbon works, but activated carbon's all coal.
Yep.
That works.
Yeah.
So now we're in a path dependency on we're going to be mining and we need to line a lot more coal to deal with a lot of this. Right? How do we make sure we also allow innovation to happen as well so we're not stuck there and then you create stranded assets? As I said, coal for a reason because there's a lot of stranded assets when it comes to coal.
100%, yeah. When you, if you were able to wave kind of a magic wand, right? I think you've said this a few times, that utilities are ratepayer systems. I think we in the audience all understand that water is not something you want to move fast and break things on. And so kind of making two and two meet there, like how would you, if you had the ability to redesign the system, you mentioned Texas and kind of California as energy examples, how would it look like if you were to just take a crack at that?
That's a great question. This is maybe, this is where I'm not an economist, so
sure.
There. But I think part of it is that, the water rights are a whole other thing. That's a different podcast for a different guest. But I think part of it is having some way to kind of price smaller things per gallon so that you can, run things so that, there's an incentive to be like, oh, okay, well, we'll try the system and we'll pay for a little bit of it and we can do some blending later, right? But at least we can spec something to try now that we can then scale up if it works. Yeah. But we don't have to put in a big CapEx upgrade. But the utilities aren't built for that right now. Their capital allocations, big capital allocation. And so there's no way for them to do smaller things, but that are big enough to produce enough data to make it show that it's worth it. Yeah. Because they're still huge systems. So you need to have, running small pilots, not that hard. But then what really hurts is the pilots that are big enough for, big systems to care about. And that's that. There's a gap there.
Yeah. What is the next, if you were to kind of backcast the next 15, 20 years of where CoFlux is, what does that look like? Like, are you guys in every single wastewater plant?
No, so I think that, there's going to be a lot of different time for different things, right? We're going to really be targeting, right, both these, areas where there are contaminated sites And then moving on to things industrial users. So obviously semiconductors, where we can do really cost-effective point source reduction, and that can help then move things early on. So that's where having clarity on what we need to hit on those levels helps a lot too. We're still not there yet. We're doing a lot of testing, and obviously regulators are moving. There's a lot of state level stuff, but the fractured nature doesn't help, obviously. And then obviously eventually we would love to see a system in drinking water where we can do cost. Now, there might be some system design. You might have some initial steps, right? We've done a lot of testing actually with things like RO concentrate because you might, or some existing filtration, and then you have waste, and then how do you recycle and reuse that so you can get numbers back up? So there's a lot of, ways to play in where, we're not necessarily saying we're going to make big systems and treat every piece of water going through it on our system, but that we're going to be able to really deliver something into the market where it makes sense for these kind of medium scale waste streams where they still have the problem. We want to actually remove it, and then we can get, more water out of the systems, especially where we're seeing in water stress areas, both for industrial users.
Yeah.
And, there, which, New York doesn't actually have a water issue. Houston's actually really okay. But, Texas, Arizona.
And then the Colorado River touches right now.
Yep. And we've seen that on industry, like in Corpus Christi right now.
Yeah.
Is that it's going to be an issue where, and not just PFAS too, and this is the other thing we're thinking about, right? There's other contaminants coming down. There's other issues where how do we look at our system? Because the nice part, I think I mentioned the CoF material, is that because it's a polymer, we can actually go and design new versions for different contaminants, for different applications, for ones that maybe aren't PFAS. And that lets us have a really modular system where now we know how to build these skids and these systems. We know the tank optimization. We understand that. We just have to change the chemistry to address a contaminant, of concern or some other, one. Who knows where things are going to go, but that's how we're thinking about it. So there's a bit of a platform there long term.
Interesting. And from a supply chain and kind of manufacturing of the polymer perspective, do you see any? There's obviously going to have to be build up there, but do you see any big issues around that front?
I mean, I think getting things up to economies of scale, so they cost, and obviously there's some, fancy chemistry there. So finding the right suppliers, figuring out what we're going to have to bring in-house versus out-of-house as we scale is, there. But those are all standard chemical industry things. Thankfully, there's like a
playbook for that.
There's a playbook for that. Yeah. I can call people about that. I can hire someone who's done it before.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's execution, absolutely. But we're not. That's what worries me the least, actually, this keeps you up in life. It's the one that, is going to cost money, but it's one where, I always like to think about it, when you're starting the company early on, I think, my co-founder Dana she had an MBA, and my co-founder Jeremy, he also did his PhD, right? He's a chemical engineer. He does a lot of reactor stuff. I, in theory, did the chemistry. Now I think I do things like come on to podcasts and raise money.
Yeah.
But talk to customers. Actually, that's mainly what I do.
Sure.
But early on, she's like, okay, move fast. I was like, well, early on, there's still a lot of science and understanding to do. You can't really, the money and time bucket aren't fungible because it turns out that chemistry and physics move at the rate of 1 second per second.
Sure.
And you just take it out the data's going to come back, and we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And you can only parallelize so many things. And PFAS testing's hard, so that's there. But then now a lot of it there is that's you hit the money button, to go faster.
Yeah.
So that's how there. So a lot of what we spent the last 2 years, and this is where, I'm doing that, and that's where how do you do things so that you can become investable. So I was in something called the Activate Fellowship. I know I've brought it up to you before. And Activate actually is great. It was originally came out of Berkeley lab, but it's a 2-year fellowship focused on translating science into research. So a lot of ones. So a lot of PhDs. So people who look me, I did a PhD in postdoc at Race, and we said that kind of at the top, but. From there, and they have now 5 cohorts. So Berkeley, New York, Boston, Houston, and one anywhere. And so you both get kind of initial funding, do that, a lot of connections, a lot of training on how to run a business, because the thesis is how do we make scientists and entrepreneurs? They're kind of the right people, especially early on, to lead the business. And so that was a huge kind of one to move into the point now where we have things that are ready to go into the field that we're starting to put out tomorrow, that we can really do both this capture and destruction, make simpler treatment trains, right? And go after waste that is going to be very complicated to deal with if you have to do multiple steps and shipment.
Impressive. That's awesome. One thing that comes up on the pod a few times is around this point of use and kind of waste side of water. do you envision, or do you see that there's some value in having like a pod, right? Like you can almost have like wastewater reuse. You have like black water and gray water coming out. Then there's like this PFAS destruction piece, and then there's like a, how do we get this back to potable water? Like what is
a pod? Yeah, so it's fun. It's funny what that concept actually there, and so. When I was an undergrad at Duke, they're still doing this. I was with a couple of Mark Deshusses, the Gates Foundation. So Bill Gates started this reinventing the toilet challenge in 2011.
Yeah, I remember that.
And a lot of it was this exact idea, right? And I actually, an undergrad, the lab I worked at Duke was part of that challenge, and there was a system sitting in the lab that includes a toilet that people would use to go test to get samples in the lab. So it was a BSL-2 lab, which for the one is a biosafety lab. And so, there's a lot of ways to think about that. And I think that there's interest there, right? But the whole thing with any of these kind of, modular, like potable systems, especially what's hard is the power.
Yeah.
Right? How do you power them? Now, I think batteries and solar, we're seeing that. But when you're thinking about, more of these off-grid things, because when you have existing utilities and existing systems, the issue is not, can I come up with a box that I can just plug in and is ready to go?
Sure.
It's how to do process engineering to make this as easy and painless as possible. And that's a different question. So sometimes I think we actually get too fed up on like containers. My co-founder Jeremy actually hates containers.
Yeah.
Two reasons. One, he said, if you ever render a container, it means that you don't have an idea what it looks like, right? Anyone can render a container.
Sure.
And two, right, containers actually have their own challenges. So like, you want to put a container on a site in California, well, is there a pressure vessel in it? Great, you now need to, that's the pressurized vessel, you now go permit that.
Yeah, yeah.
You open it up. I knew someone who was a plant manager for, not a water plant, it was a biogas plant. And he literally just cut a hole in the container that he got delivered, so he didn't have to permit it.
Yeah.
Because as long as he took the top off, right, the pressure issue, the gas accumulation issue didn't matter. So I think that we are sometimes a little too prone to like containerizing systems. Because it looks good.
Yeah.
It sounds nice. But like, if you actually go to talk to process engineers, right, it's hard to move and hard to access. So we've always thought about putting everything on skids, right, putting things on trailers. So then you can get into them, you can move them around. So then you're popping out. The modular parts becomes your reactor, right? So changing out a reactor, and then you're talking about a 50-gallon tank, right, that one person can move. You don't need a forklift.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of going back to the question? What would you pair this with? Is there any other tangential or complementary technologies around point of use?
Point of use, yeah. I mean, I think this is where pairing of things, with this is where membrane systems do make sense.
Yeah.
If you're talking about larger scale, because then, if you have point of use, right, or some sort of reuse, that's where you do get concentrates you have to treat. We deal with salinity relatively well, so we've tested some really nasty brines, and then that's where we see a lot of change on it. I think that maybe because we are using UV, where there's some disinfection, right? Especially if you're using some sort of UV advanced system, right? And there could be play there, where if you already are using some sort of UV disinfection or UV water treatment odor control systems, that's where that could help to both deal with some of the micropollutants as well. But I think that's going to be evolving on it, and it depends if we're talking industrial, but if we're talking more wastewater point of view stuff. But that's it's a question that people have been working on for longer than I have.
Sure.
And I've seen it, people are finally, compared to, when I was thinking about it, as a, 21-year-old, an undergrad 10 years ago, to now, I think there's been some movement on it, but it's still not solved.
Yeah, yeah. The 3M settlement phase 2 deadline is, I think, July 31st, right? And this pushes municipalities to like make what's happening there? Like, what is the 3M settlement?
Yeah, I would. You know what? I haven't been as up to date on the 3M settlement stuff.
Okay.
There, I'm gonna have to look at it. And I know a lot of it was testing. Was my initial one on it, but I know they were doing some things. But I have not read the whole settlement document cover to cover.
Okay.
I have read some of the other guidances, but because the settlement also covers some, testing and also health effects stuff for people. So it's really a complex one. So I actually don't know what's in the deadline. I'm gonna have to go look it up now.
Yeah.
But
awesome. We're coming towards the end of the episode, and I ask everybody this question, which you probably have heard in the last few. Do you have a book, a movie, or a TV show that has like profoundly changed the way that you look at the world?
So no, I was actually, because I knew this, I was actually asking friends. So I was asking Actually, I was asking Ari's not here, but I was asking Ari's fiance, who's also I grew up fencing with, yesterday, and she was like, you should just her and some high school friends were hanging out, and their initial joke was, oh, you would just love to read Wikipedia to say that, but actually thinking about it, and this New York's in there, I'm gonna actually go with The Power Broker by Robert Moses.
Power Broker, yeah.
For talking about infrastructure, which I actually read a little bit in high school. I did read it again in college. And, we're thinking about infrastructure on how to get things done, right? Good and bad there.
Yeah.
But, a lot of shaping about what the built environment is like, where things that people don't consider worth looking at or talking about. And then, what happens when, one person can make decisions that might not be great.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge influence in my thinking, both from talking from highways to water to why I studied what I did in grad school.
I love that. Awesome. The Power Broker. I'll definitely throw those in the show notes.
Yeah. It's a long book.
It is a long book. I think I have it on my nightstand. It's like I've only gotten through like a third of it.
Yeah, it's 1,200 pages. There's lots of detours.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Alec, any last notes for the audience or anything else you'd like to cover?
No, I think we covered a lot of things. We're really excited now to move from, what was a lot of R&D to getting product out into the world, and always willing to, this is where I guess I gotta, last thing is that if you have an impacted waste stream and want to, talk about, running some treatability samples and running a pilot, always happy to chat.
Awesome. And where can people find you?
So our website is CoFlux at CoFluxPurification.com, and then the general email is info@CoFluxPurification.com, and then also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Cool. Awesome. Alec, thanks a ton for joining us.
Yeah.